They said the noise of my slippers on the floor was ruining the ambiance, so they locked me in my room. On Christmas Eve. I don't think I will ever forget the sound of that click, the latch sliding into place from the outside, as if I were a restless child who needed to be contained, or a stray dog scratching at the wrong door. I am 82 years old. I have survived childbirth without anesthesia, the slow death of a husband who forgot my name before he forgot how to breathe, a son's bitter divorce, a lifetime of bills I paid in silence. But nothing prepared me for that small, deliberate act of exclusion disguised as care. I live alone now in a modest unit at a retirement complex where the walls are painted beige and the neighbors' televisions murmur through the thin plaster. But there is a garden where I can sit in the morning sun, and no one tells me I walk too loudly. Here, no one locks my door. But on that night, in the house my daughter had filled with garlands and scented candles, in the house I had once helped her put a down payment on, I was treated as if my existence were an inconvenience too heavy to bear in the glow of their curated holiday perfection. I can still see the living room as it looked before they sent me upstairs. Everything arranged not for comfort, but for display, like the pages of one of those glossy magazines Carla, my daughter-in-law, used to leave on the coffee table. The tree stood in the corner near the big bay window, dripping with gold ornaments and glass baubles that cost more than my monthly pension. A pine-scented candle burned on the mantel, even though the tree itself was real and already perfumed the air. There were lights wound around the staircase, lights along the bookshelves, even lights around the frames of photographs that did not include me. Every detail shimmered with intention, every shadow accounted for, and yet nowhere in that perfect room was there space for an old woman with swollen ankles, hands bent from arthritis, and a laugh that sometimes broke into a cough. I had brought gifts, of course. I always do. Small things, made by my hands because my purse is not deep, and my pride will not allow me to come empty-handed. Knitted socks for the children in colors I knew they would not like, but that would at least keep them warm. Jars of jam I had put up in August, when the raspberries were heavy on the vine. A scarf I wove slowly in the evenings, when the loneliness crept too close. I placed the bag by the coat rack when I arrived. It was still there, unopened, when I left. I never saw the children open a single one of my parcels. I do not think they even noticed. The evening began the way such evenings always do. Polite greetings, quick kisses that tasted of obligation, a plate of hors d'oeuvres placed into my hand so that I would not wander into the kitchen and upset the choreography. My daughter, Marianne, moved through the room with the efficiency of a hostess who knows her worth is measured in appearances. She wore a red dress, her hair pinned just so, and she did not look at me when she laughed at her husband's jokes. When I arrived, she said, "Mother, so glad you could make it. The way people say, the delivery is on time." My son-in-law, Victor, offered me a glass of wine, then immediately turned away before I could refuse it, so I sipped slowly at the dry liquid that stung my tongue and made my head ache. The grandchildren waved without rising from the couch where they sat, scrolling on glowing screens, their faces bathed in blue light. Strangers in my bloodline. I tried to tell myself it was enough, that being present was something, that family is not obliged to be tender so long as it is there. But then the small humiliations began, one by one, so subtle that if I had spoken them aloud, someone might have called me paranoid. When I asked if I could help in the kitchen, Carla pressed her manicured hand against my arm and said, "Just relax. It's all under control." her smile too tight to be mistaken for kindness. When I moved to take a seat near the fire, a nephew whispered that the chair was reserved for younger Bones. When I laughed at one of Victor's jokes, my laugh too sharp and too sudden, he said gently, "Maybe have some water. It's been a long day." As if I were a tipsy aunt embarrassing the party. It was all done in the open, all in the name of politeness, but I could feel the circle tightening, feel the quiet push toward the margins where I was meant to stay. It was after I'd dropped a champagne flute, after my hand trembled slightly as I set it on the counter, and the glass slid to the floor with a sound like breaking ice, that Marianne decided she had had enough of me. She did not shout. She did not scold. She only smiled in front of the others and said, "Mother, maybe you should rest for a bit. Upstairs. There's a room ready for you." I protested lightly, only lightly, because I have learned the cost of resistance, but she insisted with the kind of determination that leaves no air for refusal. She guided me up the stairs herself, her nails digging lightly into my elbow, and led me into the guest room at the end of the hall. The room smelled of fresh paint and linen spray, the bed already turned down, as if they had planned for this. "Just a little rest," she said, and then, as she stepped back into the hall, the door closed. A moment later, I heard it. The slide of metal, the unmistakable sound of a lock engaged. My own daughter locked me in, like a servant who had done her duty or a fragile object that might topple in the way of the festivities. I sat on the edge of the bed, the sounds of laughter rising through the floorboards, the carols playing faintly, the shrill excitement of children unwrapping gifts that I did not give them, and I realized I had become a ghost in the house I once made possible. I stayed there for hours. No one came to check if I was warm enough, if I needed water, if my legs had stiffened from sitting too long. At 10 o'clock, the door opened briefly, and Carla placed a tray on the dresser. A plate with cold slices of turkey, a spoonful of potatoes congealed with butter, a wedge of pie that had already lost its shine. She did not look at me when she said, "Merry Christmas," and closed the door again. The lock clicked once more. I ate slowly, not because I was hungry, but because the act of chewing gave me something to do, something that felt like living rather than waiting. I thought of my husband, dead these 20 years, and wondered what he would say if he knew that the woman who had once carried this family on her back now sat in silence behind a locked door while others drank champagne and toasted to blessings. I wondered if perhaps I had done this to myself by always saying yes, by always smoothing over the cracks, by teaching my children that my love came without boundaries. I wondered, too, if they would ever realize the cruelty of what they had done, or if the story in their minds would forever be that I had needed rest, that I had preferred the quiet, that I had somehow chosen absence over inclusion. The cruelty of family is often buried in the language of care. When the latch finally opened near midnight, when the party had dwindled and the house smelled of extinguished candles and spilled wine, Marianne poked her head into the room and said, "You can come down now if you want." If I want. As if I had wanted any of this. I did not answer. I simply lay down on the bed, pulled the blanket over my shoulders, and let her close the door again, this time without locking it, though the silence was no less suffocating. I stayed until morning, listening to the pipes groan, listening to my own heart in my chest, a slow and steady drum reminding me that I was still alive, still capable of choice. By dawn, I had already decided that it would be the last time. The last time I allowed myself to be erased in the name of civility. The last time I entered a house where my presence was tolerated like background noise. The last time I gave gifts that no one opened and carried a body that no one touched. They may have locked me in, but in that silence, I found something I had not expected. The clarity that comes when humiliation finally hardens into resolve. The true confirmation that what happened to me that Christmas Eve was not a misunderstanding, not an accident, not even the result of too much wine or too much stress, came the next morning when I went down the stairs, carrying my small overnight bag in one hand and the unopened gifts in the other, and found the kitchen already cleaned of every trace of festivity, as if the evening before had been a performance meant only for photographs and not for memory. My daughter was at the counter arranging flowers in a vase, as if nothing unusual had happened, humming a carol softly to herself, and when she turned to me, she said, "Mother, you look rested. I hope the quiet did you some good," with the same calm tone she might use to ask if I had slept well at a hotel. There was no mention of the locked door, no acknowledgement that I had been excluded from the laughter, no apology for the tray of cold food delivered like an afterthought. My son-in-law sat at the table scrolling on his phone, and without lifting his eyes, he muttered, "Morning. Glad you got some peace and quiet. The kids can be a bit much." The children were in the living room, heads bent over their new devices, already absorbed in worlds that required no grandparent, and when I placed the knitted socks and jars of jam on the table, Marianne glanced at them politely and said, "We'll look at those later. Thank you so much," before sweeping them into a corner where I suspected they would be forgotten until long after I had gone. In that moment, the truth settled over me like a heavy shawl. I had not been given rest. I had been removed. And the story they would tell, the one they had already rehearsed with their silence, was that it had been for my own good. It was later, when I overheard the smallest granddaughter whispering to her cousin, not knowing that I was in the hallway behind them, that the cruelty was confirmed beyond doubt. She was being dramatic, the girl said. They had to put her upstairs or she would have ruined Christmas. I felt the words like splinters under the skin, small but impossible to dig out. Dramatic. A word they had chosen together, the adults first, then passed down to the children like a lesson in how to view me, how to dismiss me, how to turn the reality of my exclusion into a story of my own fault. I realized then that it was not a one-time lapse of judgment, not a mistake fueled by holiday chaos. It was a decision, deliberate and rehearsed, and the story they built around it was meant to absolve themselves while diminishing me. That was the moment when something inside me shifted from confusion to clarity. I did not cry. Not then. I am too old for tears that no one will acknowledge. Instead, I began to observe with the sharpness of someone cataloging evidence, noting every glance exchanged between Marianne and Victor when I entered a room, every careful omission when neighbors were mentioned, every absence of my name in stories told to the children. Later that morning, when one of the neighbors stopped by with a plate of cookies, Marianne introduced me as Mother, who's just visiting for the holidays. She's been so tired lately, needed some quiet. The neighbor smiled with sympathy, patted my hand, and said, "Oh, of course, dear. These gatherings can be overwhelming." I nodded, because I have learned the danger of contradiction. But inside, I burned with the knowledge that they had rewritten the truth and handed me a role to play. The fragile elder, too delicate to join the laughter, too frail to be trusted with the joy of her own family. It was not enough to shut me away. They had to invent a reason that made themselves kind in the telling. And I understood then that what they had taken from me was not just a holiday evening, but my right to define myself in the eyes of others. That is the kind of theft you cannot recover from with an apology. When I finally left their house the day after Christmas, Marianne hugged me at the door, perfumed and perfect, whispering, "Don't be upset, Mother. It was all for the best," while Victor carried my bag to the taxi and said, "You know, we only want what's good for you." Their words slid into my ears like oil, smooth but suffocating, meant to coat over the rough edges of reality. I sat in the back seat of the car and stared out at the frozen lawns and tidy hedges of their neighborhood, the kind of place where people wave to each other while gossiping behind curtains. And I wondered how many of those neighbors had already been told their version of events. How many believed that I had asked to be upstairs, that I had begged for solitude, that my absence from the table was a choice and not a sentence. That was when I felt the first pulse of something I had not allowed myself in years. Anger. Not the quick flare of irritation, but the deep, steady anger of recognition. They had chosen to erase me, and worse, they had chosen to disguise the erasure as compassion. It was, I realized, the oldest trick of family cruelty. To hurt you, and then insist they have done you a favor. I carried that anger with me back to my small apartment, where the poinsettia from last year still sat on the windowsill with leaves curled and brown, but stems stubbornly alive, and for the first time in years, I did not feel ashamed of it. Anger has its uses when you are old. It is a reminder that you are still awake, still present, still unwilling to be turned into a shadow. I sat at my kitchen table with the unopened gifts, with the scarf folded neatly in my lap, and I told myself aloud, they did not forget me. They excluded me. Saying it that way was like drawing a line through fog, clearing the view enough to see what had always been there. I could no longer pretend it was carelessness. I could no longer protect them with excuses. The truth was harder, but it was also cleaner. They did not want me. And once you know that, once you finally allow yourself to speak it, you cannot go back to the safety of lies. The catalyst was not the locked door itself. That was only wood and metal. The true catalyst was the moment I understood that my own daughter, the child I carried and raised and held through nights of fever, would rather rewrite me into fragility than confront her own cruelty. The catalyst was hearing my grandchild call me dramatic, repeating a script written by her parents, learning so young that the easiest way to dismiss an older woman is to paint her as unstable. The catalyst was the cold food placed at my bedside as if I were a prisoner fed without care, and the perfumed hug at the door that erased the memory of the lock with a lie. It was in those moments that something in me hardened, not into bitterness, but into clarity. I saw, perhaps for the first time, the exact shape of my invisibility. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You either let it consume you, or you begin to move. I do not know if they realized what they gave me by locking that door. Perhaps they thought they had silenced me, set me aside, neutralized me into harmlessness. But what they did, what they could not have anticipated, was to force me into a silence so complete that I began to hear myself again. And that, I would discover, is far more dangerous to them than any protest I might have made at the table. Because once a woman hears her own voice after years of swallowing it, she does not stop. She cannot. When I returned to my apartment after that visit, I thought perhaps the anger would cool into resignation, the way most of my disappointments had before. I had endured enough small slights over the years to know how to fold them into myself, how to swallow them until they became part of the ordinary ache of daily life. I told myself that perhaps I was overreacting. Perhaps it was only one bad night. Perhaps they would call in a few days to apologize or at least to check on me. But the call did not come. Not the next day, not the next week, not even when the new year passed and the calendar began again. The phone sat silent on my kitchen counter, its blank face in accusation. When I finally lifted the receiver to test the line, to be sure it was not broken, I heard the dial tone humming steadily, mocking my hope. I left the gifts on the small table near the door, thinking someone might stop by to collect them, but no one did. The scarf I had woven remained folded in its box. The jam slowly crystallized. The socks remained unworn. It was as if the family I had spent decades serving had decided, without ceremony, that my contributions had expired, that I was no longer required in their version of the story. The escalation came quietly, not in one dramatic gesture, but in the steady accumulation of silence. Days turned into weeks, and the absence of contact became its own form of communication. They were not busy. I knew their habits too well for that excuse. Marianne had always been quick to post photographs online of every holiday, every brunch, every carefully curated gathering. And though I do not have the internet myself, one of the neighbors at the complex often showed me the pictures when she scrolled through her tablet in the lounge. There they were, my daughter and her family, smiling in front of the very tree from which I had been exiled, clinking glasses at dinner parties, taking trips to the ski lodge where once, many years ago, I had carried Marianne in my arms after she twisted her ankle. In each picture, I saw not only their faces, but the deliberate space where mine should have been. They had edited me out not by cropping a frame, but by refusing me entry to the scene. That, I realized, was worse than the locked door. The knowledge that they were rewriting me into absence even in the public narrative of their lives. At first, I tried to reach out, leaving short, careful messages on the answering machine. Nothing accusatory, only small offerings of connection. "It's Mother. I just wanted to hear how everyone is doing." Or, "I made a batch of soup. I can freeze some for you if you like." None were returned. The silence grew so consistent that even my own voice, when I replayed the messages before deleting them, sounded foolish to me, brittle and eager. I stopped calling after the 5th attempt, ashamed of my own persistence, ashamed that I was chasing affection like a beggar at the back door. That was when I began to notice the difference in how I carried myself, even within the walls of my own apartment. I moved more quietly, as if I had internalized their complaint about my slippers. I ate smaller meals, as if to minimize my presence. I spent longer hours staring out the window at the courtyard below, where other residents sometimes gathered to smoke or gossip. But I stayed inside, unwilling to risk the humiliation of being overheard or dismissed. It was not that they had locked me in again, but that I had begun to lock myself away, convinced that my presence was disruptive wherever it went. The neighbors noticed, of course. They are not unkind people, most of them, but they are used to grief and withdrawal here, used to seeing residents fade into silence when family ties loosen or disappear. One woman, a retired teacher named Mrs. Donnelly, knocked on my door one afternoon with a plate of cookies and said, "Haven't seen you at bingo, dear. Everything all right?" I smiled, thanked her, took the plate, and lied. "Just a bit tired, that's all." She nodded knowingly, the way people do when they have heard such excuses before, and I closed the door as quickly as politeness allowed. I did not want her pity. I did not want anyone's pity. Yet I also did not want to confess the truth, that my own children had treated me like a nuisance and discarded me for the sake of appearances. Shame is a quiet predator. It curls around your heart and convinces you that speaking will only make the wound larger. So I stayed silent, and the silence became its own prison. But in that quiet, something unexpected began to grow. It was not hope, at least not in the beginning. It was more like a stubborn refusal to disappear completely. I found myself writing long letters late at night, not to anyone in particular, just to the page, recounting in detail the things I remembered from my life. The sound of my mother's voice calling me in from play, the smell of my husband's jacket after he came home from the mill, the warmth of Marianne's forehead pressed against mine when she was a child and frightened of storms, These memories did not soften me toward my present family. If anything, they sharpened the contrast between what had been and what was. But they also reminded me that I had existed before them, that I had been whole and strong and capable long before I was reduced to a role at the edges of their dinner parties. I began to feel that perhaps, if I could fill enough pages, I could build a world where I was not erased. At first it was only for myself, but later I began to wonder if someone else might read them one day, someone who would understand that the quiet violence of neglect is as real as any shout. The days stretched into winter's long gray hours, and though the phone remained silent, I no longer sat waiting for it. Instead, I began to take longer walks in the courtyard, greeting the neighbors with polite nods, sitting sometimes on the bench even when the air was sharp with cold. It was not defiance, exactly, but it was a kind of presence, a way of reminding myself that I still occupied space in the world, that I was not as invisible as my children had made me. Yet every time I passed the row of mailboxes and saw nothing but advertisements and bills in mine, I felt the reminder sting. They were not thinking of me. They had left me in a locked room and then left me in silence, and I had to decide whether I would let that silence define me or whether I would step beyond it. The escalation, I realized, was not that their cruelty had increased, but that its absence had deepened. The first act was the lock on the door. The second was the lock on their voices, their absence becoming a louder rejection than any insult could have been. And so the days passed, each one layering over the last like thin sheets of ice, until the weight of them made it difficult to breathe. Yet beneath that weight, I began to feel a faint stirring, a restlessness I had not known in years, the sense that if my own family had cast me aside, then perhaps I was free in a way I had never been before. I had no one left to disappoint but myself, and that, though frightening, also carried with it the faintest scent of possibility. The first real change came not as some great thunderclap of revelation, but as something so small that at first I barely noticed it, the way you might not hear the first crack of ice shifting on a frozen lake until the whole surface trembles. It was late January, the sky still heavy with the weight of winter, and I was carrying my trash down to the communal bins behind the building when I stumbled slightly on the uneven pavement. Before I could right myself, a voice from the other side of the courtyard called out, sharp and steady, "Careful there. You've got to watch those cracks. They'll take you down before you know it." It was Mrs. Donnelly, the retired teacher, her scarf wound tightly around her neck, her eyes bright despite the chill. She came closer, taking the bag of trash from my hand with surprising strength, and said, "You walk too much with your head bent. Look up, you'll see what's coming." It was such an ordinary piece of advice, the kind you might give to a child, but for some reason it lodged inside me like a pebble in the shoe, impossible to ignore. That night, I lay awake thinking about it. Not about the sidewalk, but about the way I had been moving through my life with my head lowered, waiting for the next small humiliation, the next silence, the next exclusion. I had been walking bent for years, and perhaps it was time to look up again. The next morning, when Mrs. Donnelly knocked on my door with the excuse of returning the plate I had never asked her to take, I surprised myself by inviting her in for tea. The apartment was nothing special. Faded curtains, a worn rug, the faint smell of mothballs no matter how often I cleaned. But she sat at the small table as if it were the most natural place in the world to be. We talked first about trivial things, the heating system, the manager's laziness, the weather. But then, perhaps sensing the weight I carried, she asked gently about my Christmas. I had every intention of lying again, of offering the polished story that Marianne and Victor would have preferred me to tell, but something in Mrs. Donnelly's gaze stopped me. Without fanfare, without even raising her voice, she had the look of someone who would not be fooled by half-truths. So I told her. Not all of it at once, but enough. The locked door, the tray of cold food, the whisper of the word dramatic passed down to the children. I expected disbelief, or worse, pity. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and said with a firmness that startled me, "That's not family. That's abuse dressed up as etiquette. Don't you dare let them convince you otherwise." It was the first time anyone had named it so bluntly, and the word landed in the room like a dropped stone. Abuse. I had not allowed myself to think of it that way. Abuse was bruises, shouted insults, slammed doors. Abuse was violent, visible, undeniable. But what she described, being locked away, silenced, diminished, rewritten into fragility, was its own form of violence, quieter, but no less corrosive. The moment she named it, something in me straightened, not defensively, but with the weary relief of recognition. It was as if someone had finally turned on the light in a dim corridor I had been walking for years. I felt my shoulders lift, my chest expand, the faint but real sensation of space where there had been none. And I realized that if one woman could believe me, then perhaps others could too. And if others could believe me, then maybe I did not have to keep swallowing the silence alone. In the weeks that followed, I found myself seeking her company more often, walking with her to the corner store, sharing soup recipes, even sitting beside her at bingo, though I had always avoided the game before. She was not sentimental, which suited me. She did not cluck or coo or insist on cheering me. Instead, she asked questions that forced me to see things clearly. Why had I signed over money to Marianne when she bought the house? Why had I allowed Victor to manage the utilities in my name? Why had I stopped insisting on visits with the grandchildren in my own home? Each answer I gave revealed another layer of the ways I had allowed myself to be diminished, not out of weakness, but out of habit, out of the belief that yielding was the price of love. "You've mistaken obedience for kindness," Mrs. Donnelly said once, stirring sugar into her tea. "There's nothing kind about disappearing for other people's comfort." Her words were sharp, but they were not cruel. They were the medicine kind of sharp, the way alcohol stings on a wound but also cleans it. Around that time, I began to take longer walks alone, not just around the courtyard, but into the neighborhood beyond. At first, it felt like trespassing, as if the world outside the retirement complex was no longer meant for me. But soon, I found a rhythm in the streets, the shops, the small park where children played even in the cold. I stopped in at a bakery one morning and bought myself a single scone, something I had not done in years because I had grown so used to baking for others, never indulging myself. The young man at the counter smiled when I counted out the coins with my stiff fingers and said, "Good choice. My grandmother always loved those." It was nothing, just a stray remark, but it warmed me in a way that surprised me. I carried the scone to the park, sat on a bench, and ate it slowly while watching the sparrows dart across the snow. It felt like a feast. It felt like reclaiming something small, but essential. The right to choose for myself. That was the turning point, though I did not recognize it as such at the time. It was not about the scone or the tea with Mrs. Donnelly, or even the naming of what had happened to me. It was about the slow, quiet realization that I had been waiting for my children to return, something they had already taken from me, something they were never going to give back. I had been waiting for an apology, for recognition, for inclusion. But waiting had turned me into a ghost. What I needed instead was to stop waiting altogether. The shift was subtle, like the change of a season that you only notice when you realize the snowdrops have already bloomed. One morning, I woke and knew with certainty that I would no longer call them, no longer leave messages, no longer offer myself for their dismissal. The silence between us would remain, but it would no longer define me. If they wished to find me, they would have to come toward me. I would not keep walking toward a locked door. That decision, small as it might sound, was a revolution inside me. I felt it in the way I stood straighter, in the way I looked the cashier in the eye, in the way I answered Mrs. Donnelly when she asked if I wanted to join a neighborhood group that met every Thursday. "Yes," I said, surprising both of us. "Yes, I will." For the first time in years, I felt the faintest echo of the woman I had once been, the one who had raised a child alone when her husband's job sent him away, the one who had worked double shifts to afford Marianne's college tuition, the one who had organized bake sales and stood in voting lines and refused to let life shrink her. She was still here, buried under years of yielding, but she was stirring. And I promised myself that I would not let her be buried again. The quiet strength I had begun to gather did not go untested for long, because the past has a way of circling back just when you have started to breathe more easily. And for women like me, the past usually comes disguised as family obligation, guilt dressed up as affection, or concern that tastes like control. It began with a letter, slipped into my mailbox among the bills and circulars, a pale envelope without return address but with handwriting I knew at once, handwriting that bent forward with urgency, every line pressed too hard into the paper as though anger itself had guided the pen. It was from Marianne, 6 pages long, a torrent of explanations that were not explanations, accusations that were not truths, and words that landed not like apologies, but like commands. She wrote that I had embarrassed the family by misrepresenting what happened on Christmas, that I was twisting events to make them sound cruel, when in fact I had been given a kindness. She wrote that I had wandered off into self-pity by not calling, that my silence was a form of punishment against her, that I was burdening her children with unnecessary confusion. Nowhere in those 6 pages was there mention of the lock. Nowhere was there acknowledgement of the tray of cold food. Nowhere was there the humility of someone who knows they have hurt another person. Instead, there was only the performance of outrage, as if the true harm had been to her image, not to my dignity. I folded the letter once, slid it back into the envelope, and sat staring at it on my kitchen table as though it were a poisonous thing I did not want to touch again. For 3 days it stayed there, a white weight in the corner of the room, until finally I placed it in a drawer beneath old bank statements and birth certificates, where it could no longer stare back at me. But letters have echoes, and Marianne's words seemed to ripple outward through the world in ways I could not control. Within a week, a neighbor brought me a newspaper clipping she thought I might want to see. On the community page was an article with my photograph, an old one from some family gathering, where I am holding a pie and smiling, my hair darker, my back straighter. The headline read, "Local Family Seeks Missing Matriarch," and the text beneath quoted Marianne and Victor extensively. They spoke of me as though I were a fragile woman who had disappeared, who might be confused or unsafe, who had become estranged through no fault of her own. They described me as vulnerable, unstable, perhaps even unwell. Not once did they say that I was alive and capable. Not once did they admit that I had chosen silence because of what they had done. Instead, they constructed a story in which I was a ghost wandering out of my own mind, a cautionary tale for the neighbors to pity. Reading those words, I felt a heat rise in me that no winter could cool. They had taken my absence and twisted it into a spectacle, a performance of concern meant to shield themselves from judgment, while erasing my voice yet again. To the world, they painted themselves as the worried children, when in truth, they were the ones who had closed the door. I laughed, though the sound startled me, sharp and loud in the stillness of my apartment. Not the type, the article said, not the type to vanish on her own, as if they had ever bothered to ask what type I was. Mrs. Donnelly was furious on my behalf, more furious than I allowed myself to be in front of her. She slammed the newspaper onto the table and said, "You ought to sue them for defamation, or at least write your own piece. Why should they get the only story?" But I shook my head, not because she was wrong, but because I knew the deeper truth. I did not need the whole town to believe me. I needed to believe myself. Still, the escalation had arrived, and the silence that had once been their weapon was now joined by pressure, the push of public narrative against my private truth. And then, as if the article had opened a door I had not consented to open, the phone calls began. At first, they were anonymous numbers, messages left on the machine with Marianne's clipped voice saying, "Mother, please, this has gone on long enough. Call us back." Or Victor's firmer tone insisting, "We need to talk about your situation. People are worried." Then came the call from a man who introduced himself as a lawyer, speaking in careful phrases about assets and well-being, as though my life were a file on his desk. I listened, thanked him, and hung up. I felt a tremor of fear at the idea that my own children might be scheming to have me declared incompetent, to wrap their hands not only around my absence, but around what little resources I had kept hidden. Yet beneath the fear was a steel that surprised me. They could not undo the clarity I had already found. They could not unname what had happened. Still, it tested me. Every ring of the phone became a reminder that they were not content to let me drift quietly away. They wanted to pull me back into their narrative, to fold me once more into the shape of the dependent, the fragile, the grateful. The pressure grew heavier when Lisa, my daughter-in-law, appeared in person. She came to the cafe where I had begun spending mornings with Mrs. Donnelly and some of the other residents, her coat immaculate, her smile brittle. She stood by the counter as though she belonged there and waited until I noticed her. "Martha," she said, in a voice that trembled not with regret, but with calculation. "We need to talk." I led her to a booth at the back, my hands steady, though my heart thudded with the weight of history. She spoke quickly, spinning explanations the way she always had, saying that the lock had been a mistake, that the children were upset, that Marianne was worried sick. She used every tool of manipulation she knew: guilt, concern, nostalgia. But I had changed. I listened without interrupting, then finally said, 8 hours, Lisa. 8 hours in that room, and no one came. The words stopped her, though only for a breath. She tried again, pressing an envelope across the table, saying it contained photographs, messages, proof that I was still loved. I did not open it. I said only, "If I matter, it will not be proven by papers." She left soon after, her perfume lingering in the air like smoke after a fire, and I sat alone in the booth with my hands folded, feeling both shaken and steadier than before. The escalation was no longer just silence or public narrative. It was confrontation. They were reaching for me, not out of love, but out of fear. Fear that I had slipped beyond their control. Fear that my absence had given me a power they did not expect. And perhaps it had, though I was only beginning to grasp it. Each attempt they made to pull me back only confirmed the truth of why I had left. Each word they twisted in newspapers or letters only reminded me that I was right to step away. It was exhausting, yes, to be pursued not for who I was, but for the inconvenience of my independence, but it was also clarifying. I began to see that every act of pressure was in fact a sign of their weakness, not mine. They needed me to play the role of the grateful dependent, because without me in it, their story fell apart. Yet the hardest moment came not from Marianne or Victor, but from my grandson, the one I had always held closest in my heart. Kieran wrote to me, his letter trembling with sincerity. He said he missed me, that the family was frantic, that he did not understand why I had gone silent. His words were not manipulative. They were not rehearsed. They were raw in the way only youth can be raw. "Please, Grandma," he wrote, "just let me know you're safe." Holding his letter, I felt the full ache of what my decision cost, not just to me, but to the one person who had never treated me as an inconvenience. It was almost enough to break me, almost enough to send me back, almost enough to undo the clarity I had fought for. But I knew that if I returned, it would not be to Kieran's open arms, but to Marianne's locked doors. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in the same drawer as Marianne's furious pages, and whispered to it as though it could hear, "Not yet. Not this way." That was the second escalation, and it was crueler than the first because it forced me to stand not only against my abusers, but against the tug of love itself, the pure strand of connection that still tied me to the family name. It tested my resolve in a way the lock on the door never could, because it asked me to weigh the cost of freedom against the cost of losing even the last shred of belonging. I did not yet know how to answer that question, but I knew at least that I would not answer it on their terms. For the first time, I felt the possibility of choosing not just absence, but action. not just silence, but a voice that could no longer be rewritten. They had escalated, but so had I. The moment of decision did not come with fanfare or lightning bolts, not with shouted confrontations or slammed doors, but with the quiet, deliberate sound of my own pen scratching across paper, a sound that echoed louder in my heart than any cry of protest I could have made at the family table. I had sat for weeks with the drawer half open, Marianne's letter of fury and Kieran's letter of longing folded beside each other like two sides of the same coin, and I knew that I could not let them remain there, dormant, dictating my silence. The escalation of their pressure had pushed me into a corner, but in that corner I found a power I had not touched in decades, the power to write my own story, not as a plea, not as a secret journal to be tucked away, but as a public act, a declaration that I would not be erased. It began with a letter not to my family, but to the editor of the small local radio station that still read community notices and letters from residents, the kind of place most people ignored, but that still reached ears willing to hear. I did not sign it with my full name, only Martha from the complex. But in those 3 pages I told the truth, stripped bare of excuses, stripped bare of the polished lies my daughter had woven. I wrote about the locked door, about the cold food tray, about the silence afterward. I wrote not in anger, but in clarity, with the steady hand of someone who no longer feared being called dramatic. I ended simply. The worst part of being old is not being forgotten. It is being remembered only when it is convenient. Do not let anyone tell you that your presence is too heavy. You have a right to be in the room. When the piece was read aloud on the radio one Thursday morning, I was sitting in the common lounge with Mrs. Donnelly and a handful of other residents. At first, they did not realize it was mine, but as the words went on, as the cadence of the sentences matched the way I sometimes spoke in conversation, heads began to turn toward me. No one interrupted. No one laughed. When it ended, there was silence, the kind of silence that feels like respect, not dismissal. Then Mrs. Donnelly reached over and squeezed my hand so firmly I thought my bones might crack, and she whispered, "Well done." In that moment, I felt something shift irreversibly, a curtain tearing open, sunlight pouring in where there had only been shadow. My family's version of the story was no longer the only one. My voice had entered the air, and once spoken, it could not be locked away again. But words, while powerful, are not enough when money and control remain tangled in the hands of those who wish to diminish you. The next act of reclamation was more concrete, more final. I went to see a lawyer, not the one who had phoned me on Marianne's behalf, but a woman recommended quietly by Mrs. Donnelly, who had once been a teacher, but also, as I learned, had served on committees for elder rights and knew how the system worked. I told the lawyer everything: the financial transfers I had made when Marianne bought her house, the accounts that Victor managed for convenience, the property titles I had allowed to shift hands in the belief that it was what good mothers did for their children. The lawyer listened without judgment, her pen moving quickly across her notepad, then looked up and said, "We can change this. You are not powerless." The relief that washed over me was not immediate joy, but something heavier, the slow release of a burden I had carried so long I had forgotten how much it weighed. Over the following weeks, with her guidance, I began the process of reclaiming what was mine, not to hoard, not to wield like a weapon, but to redirect toward something that would outlive me in dignity. I transferred the remaining assets into a community trust dedicated to elder support, a cooperative fund that would provide meals, companionship, and advocacy for those left in silence, as I had been. It was my way of turning betrayal into legacy, my way of saying, "You will not profit from locking me away. You will not turn my sacrifices into your comfort while I starve on the margins." When Marianne discovered what I had done, her fury arrived not as a letter this time, but as a storming visit. She came to my door one afternoon, her cheeks flushed, her hair disheveled, words tumbling out before I even invited her in. "How could you?" she cried. "How could you take away what we built together?" I looked at her, really looked at her, the daughter I had raised, the woman who now stood before me not as a child, but as an adversary, and I felt no malice, only a weary clarity. "I didn't take away what we built," I said slowly. "I took back what was never yours to begin with." Her face twisted, not in pain but in outrage, the outrage of someone unaccustomed to being refused. She called me selfish, vindictive, cruel. I listened, my hands folded calmly in my lap, and for the first time in my life I did not try to soothe her. I did not try to explain or soften. I let her words fall and scatter like broken glass, and when she finally stopped, breathless and trembling, I said only, "This conversation is over." Then I closed the door. It was the simplest act, the most ordinary gesture, and yet it felt like the culmination of everything, the irreversible moment when the balance shifted for good. For once, I was the one who locked the door, not to exclude but to protect, not to erase but to preserve. And the silence on the other side was mine, not hers. That was the climax, not because it was loud, but because it was final. I had spoken my truth to the world. I had taken back my power in the form of both voice and resources, and I had faced the fury of the one who had once held sway over me without yielding. There was no going back after that, no possibility of slipping quietly into the role of the obedient mother again. I had chosen myself, and the choice was carved into the air like a scar that will never fade. In the months that followed, the air around me grew calmer, not because my family accepted what I had done, but because I no longer allowed their storms to reach me. They tried at first, of course. Occasional letters filled with alternating anger and pleading, telephone calls that went unanswered, even a visit or two where I chose not to open the door. Eventually, the attempts dwindled, the way a fire dies when it has nothing left to consume. Their absence, once a wound, became space, and in that space, I began to build a different kind of life, one not defined by being tolerated at someone else's table, but by the rhythm of my own choosing. I spent mornings in the garden of the complex, tending to the lavender and the small patch of roses planted by another resident long before me. I found myself talking more with neighbors, not about sorrows, but about the small, ordinary details of living, a new recipe someone tried, the aches of the weather, the gossip of the staff. I even began to laugh again, not the careful laugh I used to practice in my daughter's house, measured so as not to draw notice, but the deep, unguarded laugh of someone who no longer worries about taking up too much space. The trust I had established for elder support grew quickly, attracting attention in ways I had not expected. A small article appeared in the paper, this time not about my supposed disappearance but about the cooperative fund, written with genuine respect. Local resident establishes community initiative to combat isolation in aging, the headline read. My name was included, not hidden, and for once it felt good to see it in print, attached not to shame or pity, but to action. Neighbors began to stop me in the courtyard to thank me, to ask questions, even to share their own stories of exclusion, stories whispered for years behind closed doors. I realized then that what had been done to me was not singular, not unique. It was part of a pattern that countless women my age endure, dismissed, diminished, erased by those who should hold them close. Knowing this did not lessen my own pain, but it gave it purpose. If my voice could open even a crack of light for someone else, then the humiliation of that Christmas Eve had not been wasted. One evening, in early spring, I sat outside as the sky dimmed, a blanket over my knees, a cup of tea cooling in my hands, and I watched the bees hover over the lavender, moving with a patience that felt almost holy. A young neighbor, a woman in her 40s who had just moved into the complex to care for her ailing mother, came to sit beside me. She was tired, her eyes rimmed with worry, and after a few minutes of silence, she said, "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be enough for her." I turned to her, saw in her face the fear I once carried, the fear of failing to give what was expected, and I said quietly, "Start by hearing her. Not fixing, not controlling, not deciding, just hearing. It's the one thing I wanted most and the one thing I was denied." She nodded, and in her silence I felt a thread pass between us. Fragile, but real. The kind of connection that does not need blood to bind it. That is how my life feels now. Not repaired, not triumphant, but steadier, truer. I will not pretend that I do not still ache when I think of Kieran, or that my heart does not sometimes twist when I see mothers and daughters walking together in the park. But I do not let the ache define me. I no longer measure my worth by invitations or photographs. I measure it by mornings in the sun, by the laughter of neighbors who have come to know me as more than a shadow, by the simple peace of knowing that my story belongs to me again. If another woman, somewhere, locked away in silence, can hear my words and recognize herself, then I have done what I set out to do. And so I leave this story with you, whoever you may be. Do not wait for someone else to open the door. Do not accept the lie that you are too fragile, too inconvenient, too much. You are not a problem to solve. You are a person to hear. Start there.